The cruelest prisons are not built with walls. They are built with laughter that follows you everywhere you go. Adrian Carter had stopped counting the birthdays that came and went without changing anything. At 38 years old, he was known throughout the quiet town of Hollow Creek as the Virgin Omega, a nickname people repeated with careless amusement whenever they thought he was out of earshot. Some claimed he was too quiet. Others whispered he was too ordinary. A few insisted fate itself had simply forgotten him. Adrian never argued with any of them. Every morning before the sun fully climbed above the maple trees lining Main Street, he unlocked the weathered front door of Carter Antiques, the little family shop his late grandparents had left him. The bell above the entrance gave its familiar chime, followed by the comforting scent of aged wood, polished brass, and forgotten history. Shelves overflowed with vintage clocks, porcelain figurines, faded photographs, and hand-carved furniture that had survived generations of families. Adrian loved every piece because each carried a story, even if nobody remembered it anymore. Perhaps that was why he felt so at home among forgotten things. Customers drifted in throughout the day, searching for hidden treasures or unusual decorations, but conversations rarely lasted long. Some smiled politely before leaving with a purchase. Others exchanged knowing glances after noticing Adrian still wore no mating bracelet, no family ring, no signs of the life everyone expected an Omega his age to have built decades earlier. Even teenagers passing the storefront sometimes laughed without understanding why. Adrian always answered with the same gentle smile, pretending their words weighed nothing at all. Kindness had become both his greatest strength and his quietest shield. That afternoon, Mrs. Henderson, one of his oldest customers, stopped by to browse vintage china. Before leaving, she sighed sympathetically. "You are one of the finest people this town has ever known, Adrian. I only wish everyone else could see it." Adrian chuckled softly while wrapping her purchase in brown paper. Maybe they are too busy looking for something extraordinary to notice ordinary people. She reached across the counter and squeezed his hand. There is nothing ordinary about a kind heart. After she left, silence returned to the little shop. Adrian wandered between the aisles, carefully dusting an antique bookshelf that had remained unsold for nearly 3 years. Outside, late afternoon sunlight painted long golden shadows across the sidewalk. At exactly 4 o'clock, a sleek black luxury sedan rolled quietly to the curb across the street. Its windows were dark enough to hide whoever sat inside. Adrian noticed it only because the polished finish reflected the sunlight directly through his front window. He glanced outside for a moment before returning to his work. Expensive cars rarely visited Hollow Creek, but tourists occasionally lost their way. 10 minutes passed. The sedan never moved. Another 10 minutes slipped by. Still nothing. As Adrian locked the shop that evening, he glanced toward the vehicle once more. It remained parked exactly where it had been, silent and unmoving. He shrugged to himself and walked home carrying a small paper bag filled with leftover pastries from the bakery next door. Across the street, inside the motionless sedan, a pair of calm gray eyes followed him until he disappeared around the corner. The driver finally spoke after several minutes of silence. "Sir, should I pull closer?" The man seated in the back gently shook his head. His voice was low, steady, and impossible to read. "No." His gaze never left the empty sidewalk where Adrian had vanished. "Not yet." The driver nodded without another question. He had transported powerful men for nearly 20 years, yet he had never seen any of them spend 3 quiet afternoons parked outside an antique shop without stepping out of the car. As the evening sky slowly darkened above Hollow Creek, the mysterious sedan finally eased away from the curb, leaving behind only one unanswered question. Why would someone who could command an empire spend hours silently watching the loneliest Omega in town? The black sedan returned the next morning at exactly 8 o'clock, parking across from Carter Antiques with the same quiet precision as the day before. Adrian Carter noticed it while arranging a collection of vintage pocket watches in the front display, but he quickly dismissed the sight as another coincidence. Hollow Creek was a small town where unusual things rarely stayed unusual for long. If someone had business nearby, there was no reason to think twice about it. He unlocked the display case, carefully polished each watch, and greeted the first customer with his usual warm smile. By lunchtime, the mysterious vehicle was still there. It never blocked traffic. Nobody stepped out. Nobody rolled down a window. It simply waited in complete silence. Across the street, inside the rear seat, Vincent DeLuca rested an old leather notebook on his lap without opening it. His driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror before speaking carefully. "You have canceled 3 meetings this week." Vincent answered without taking his eyes off the antique shop. "Reschedule them." The driver hesitated for a moment. "Your board will not be pleased." Vincent's expression remained calm. "They do not need to understand every decision I make." The conversation ended there. People who worked for Vincent had learned years ago that his quietest orders were usually the ones that mattered most. Inside the shop, Adrian spent the afternoon helping a young couple searching for furniture for their first apartment. He suggested a beautifully restored oak table that had belonged to a local family nearly 70 years earlier. When the couple admitted it cost more than they had budgeted, Adrian quietly reduced the price himself. "Every home deserves at least one piece with a story," he said with an easy smile. After they left, his elderly neighbor from the bakery stepped inside, carrying a paper bag filled with fresh cinnamon rolls. "You gave them another discount, did you not?" she asked with playful disappointment. Adrian laughed softly. "They needed the table more than I needed the extra money." She shook her head with affectionate disbelief. "One day your kindness is going to surprise the whole world." Adrian smiled, but said nothing. He had heard countless versions of that sentence throughout his life, yet nothing ever changed. Late in the afternoon, the bell above the entrance chimed once more. Adrian looked up, expecting another regular customer, but instead saw a tall man wearing a charcoal overcoat step quietly inside. His appearance was elegant without being flashy, and there was something remarkably composed about the way he observed the shelves before speaking. "Good afternoon," Adrian said warmly. "Please let me know if I can help you find anything." Vincent slowly walked toward an antique globe displayed near the center of the shop. His fingertips brushed lightly across the polished wood before he looked at Adrian for the first time. "I am searching for something with history," he replied. Adrian smiled naturally. "Then you have come to the right place. Around here, everything has survived long enough to earn one." Vincent's eyes softened almost imperceptibly. For several minutes, they wandered through the store together while Adrian explained where different pieces had come from and why preserving old memories mattered more than chasing perfect appearances. Vincent listened with complete attention, asking thoughtful questions but revealing almost nothing about himself. Before leaving, he purchased the antique globe without attempting to negotiate the price. As Adrian carefully wrapped it in protective paper, Vincent quietly asked, "Do you believe forgotten things can still become valuable again?" Adrian looked up with the same gentle sincerity that had defined him for years. "I think their value never disappeared. Sometimes people simply need someone willing to see it." Vincent held his gaze for one silent heartbeat before accepting the package. "Thank you," he said softly. Then he walked out of the shop, leaving Adrian with the strange feeling that the conversation had somehow meant far more to the mysterious stranger than it had appeared. By the end of the week, Vincent DeLuca had become a familiar face inside Carter Antiques, although nothing about him felt ordinary. He never arrived with an entourage. He never answered phone calls while browsing. He never behaved like someone in a hurry. Instead, he wandered quietly among shelves filled with forgotten treasures, asking Adrian Carter thoughtful questions about old paintings, handcrafted music boxes, and faded family photographs whose owners had long since disappeared from memory. Adrian found himself looking forward to those visits more than he cared to admit. There was something unexpectedly peaceful about talking to a customer who genuinely listened instead of simply waiting for his turn to speak. One cool Thursday afternoon, Vincent paused in front of an antique pocket compass resting inside a glass display case. "Do you think people can ever truly find their way back after getting lost for many years?" he asked. Adrian considered the question while unlocking the display. "I think some people spend their whole lives believing they are lost when they have really just been walking toward the wrong destination." Vincent smiled almost imperceptibly. "That sounds like experience speaking." Adrian laughed softly. "Perhaps it is just something old antiques have taught me. The things people throw away often survive longer than the things they treasure." Their conversation ended when another customer entered the shop, and Vincent quietly stepped aside while Adrian welcomed an elderly couple searching for a vintage rocking chair. As Adrian patiently demonstrated the craftsmanship of several pieces, Vincent observed the effortless kindness with which he treated everyone. He noticed how Adrian remembered returning customers by name, how he carried heavy furniture without being asked, and how he quietly reduced prices whenever he sensed someone genuinely loved an item but could not comfortably afford it. Nothing Adrian did appeared extraordinary on the surface, yet Vincent knew that quiet compassion like this had become increasingly rare. Outside the shop, however, Hollow Creek had begun paying attention. The owner of the diner across the street noticed the same luxury sedan arriving almost every afternoon. The florist mentioned it to the pharmacist. The pharmacist mentioned it to the barber. Before long, whispers traveled through the entire downtown district. People speculated that a wealthy investor intended to purchase the antique shop. Others guessed Adrian had inherited a secret fortune. A few simply watched with curiosity whenever the elegant stranger appeared. Late that afternoon, as Adrian locked the front door after closing, his neighbor from the hardware store approached with an uncertain expression. "Adrian," he began carefully, "do you actually know who that man is?" Adrian glanced toward Vincent, who was placing a carefully wrapped antique clock into the trunk of the waiting sedan. "Not really," Adrian admitted. "He enjoys old things. We mostly talk about history." The neighbor lowered his voice. "That is Vincent DeLuca." Adrian searched his memory before shaking his head apologetically. "Should I recognize the name?" The older man stared at him in disbelief. "Around here, everyone recognizes that name. He owns companies all over the country. People say even powerful executives wait weeks just to get 10 minutes on his calendar." Adrian looked back toward the departing sedan with quiet surprise. Nothing about Vincent's visits had suggested someone accustomed to that kind of influence. He had never mentioned business, success, or wealth. He had only asked about forgotten objects and listened to stories most people ignored. As the black sedan disappeared beyond the intersection, Adrian found himself wondering why a man who could choose to be anywhere in the world kept returning to a small antique shop in a town that almost everyone else had forgotten. The rumors surrounding Carter Antiques grew louder with each passing day, but Adrian Carter refused to let them change the quiet rhythm of his life. Every morning he swept the front sidewalk, unlocked the old oak door, and welcomed anyone who wandered inside, whether they intended to buy something or simply escape the afternoon heat. The curious glances from neighbors became more frequent, and strangers occasionally entered the shop only to see whether the elegant businessman everyone had begun discussing would appear again. Adrian found the attention uncomfortable. He had spent most of his life blending into the background, and suddenly people were watching him for reasons he could not understand. One Monday afternoon, a well-dressed man introduced himself as Daniel Mercer, a representative for a national property investment company. He complimented the charm of the antique shop before presenting a polished folder filled with architectural sketches and redevelopment plans. According to Daniel, several buildings along Main Street were being considered for renovation, and Carter Antiques occupied one of the most desirable locations. Adrian listened politely while the proposal was explained, but his answer never changed. "I appreciate your offer," he said with a warm smile, "but this shop has belonged to my family for generations. I have no interest in selling." Daniel maintained his professional expression, although a trace of disappointment crossed his face. "You might wish to reconsider after reviewing the financial figures." Adrian gently closed the folder and returned it across the counter. "Some things cannot be measured by market value." Daniel accepted the folder, thanked him for his time, and quietly left the store. Adrian believed the conversation had ended there. Yet over the following week, several unusual events began unfolding. A supplier unexpectedly delayed an important furniture delivery without explanation. A maintenance company postponed repairs to the antique shop's aging roof after canceling twice in a row. Even the insurance office informed Adrian that additional paperwork would be required before renewing a policy that had never presented problems before. None of the issues were serious on their own, but together they created an uneasy feeling that something invisible had shifted around him. Adrian blamed simple bad luck and continued working with his usual patience, determined not to become discouraged. Across town, Vincent DeLuca sat in a quiet conference room while Victor Hale reviewed a collection of reports. Victor paused before sliding a single file across the polished table. "The redevelopment company is connected to 3 investment firms that have quietly acquired properties in neighboring counties," he explained. Vincent opened the folder and read each page without changing his expression. After several moments, he closed it again. Adrian declined their offer. Victor nodded. Immediately, a faint smile appeared on Vincent's face. I expected nothing less. He remained silent for another moment before giving his next instruction. Acquire the vacant warehouse behind the antique shop and restore it. Then purchase the empty storefront beside the bakery and lease it to local businesses at below-market rates. Victor looked up with mild surprise. You intend to strengthen the entire block? Vincent met his gaze calmly. If the neighborhood remains healthy, Carter Antiques remains protected without Adrian ever feeling that someone rescued him. Later that afternoon, Vincent visited the shop as though nothing unusual had happened. Adrian greeted him with his familiar smile and showed him a beautifully restored writing desk that had recently arrived from a century-old farmhouse. They spent nearly an hour discussing craftsmanship, history, and the satisfaction of preserving things others overlooked. Adrian never mentioned the property developer or the recent inconveniences because he did not want to burden anyone else with his worries. Vincent never mentioned them because he had already decided they would never become Adrian's burden again. As Vincent stepped outside at sunset, he glanced quietly along Main Street before entering the waiting sedan. For the first time since arriving in Hollow Creek, he realized simply watching from a distance might no longer be enough. Rain fell steadily over Hollow Creek the following Friday, turning the sidewalks into ribbons of silver beneath the streetlights. Business was slower than usual, giving Adrian Carter time to organize boxes that had remained untouched in the storage room for years. Hidden beneath old newspapers and faded receipts, he discovered a weathered cardboard carton marked simply with his grandfather's handwriting. Curious, Adrian carried it into the shop and carefully lifted the lid. Inside rested dozens of worn photographs, handwritten letters, and a small leather journal that had belonged to his grandmother. Most of the pages described ordinary family memories, but one yellowed envelope slipped from between them and landed on the floor. It contained a faded photograph of a community shelter that had once stood nearly 200 miles away in the city. Adrian stared at the image for several moments, sensing an unexpected familiarity he could not quite explain. He remembered volunteering there briefly when he was 18 before returning home to help care for his grandparents after his grandfather became ill. The memories were scattered and incomplete, yet they carried a quiet warmth that made him smile. Just then the front bell chimed. Vincent DeLuca stepped inside, carrying only a folded umbrella. He immediately noticed the old photograph resting on the counter. You found something important, he observed gently. Adrian looked up. I found pieces of my grandparents' memories. He picked up the faded photograph and studied it again. I had almost forgotten I volunteered at this shelter for a few weeks when I was younger. Vincent's calm expression remained unchanged, but his heartbeat quickened beneath the quiet confidence he always carried. Adrian continued speaking without realizing the significance of his own words. There were so many people coming and going that summer. Families, teenagers, children. I doubt anyone there would remember me now. Vincent slowly removed his gloves before answering. Sometimes one person remembers enough for both. Adrian smiled politely, assuming Vincent was speaking in general terms. I suppose that is true. For several minutes, they sorted through the old photographs together. Adrian laughed softly while pointing out pictures of his grandparents standing outside the antique shop decades earlier. Vincent listened more than he spoke, quietly watching the kindness that had remained unchanged despite the passing of 20 years. When Adrian stepped into the back room to answer a telephone call, Victor Hale entered through the still-open front door after arriving unexpectedly from the city. He approached Vincent with careful urgency. Everything has been completed, Victor said quietly. The investment group withdrew every redevelopment proposal this morning. They sold their remaining interests and left the county. Vincent nodded once. Good. Victor hesitated before lowering his voice even further. You cannot continue hiding forever. He deserves to know why you came here. Vincent looked toward the back room, where Adrian's quiet voice could still be heard speaking with a customer over the telephone. His expression softened in a way almost no one else had ever witnessed. Not until he chooses to trust me because of who I am today, he replied. If I reveal the past too soon, gratitude will become a burden instead of a gift. Victor followed Vincent's gaze and finally understood that this had never been about repaying a debt. It had become something much deeper. Adrian returned carrying 2 cups of freshly brewed coffee, completely unaware of the conversation that had just taken place. He handed one cup to Vincent with an easy smile. "You always seem to arrive when the weather is terrible." Vincent accepted the coffee and smiled back with quiet affection. "Perhaps I have simply become very good at finding the place that feels most like home." The following week brought unexpected changes that Adrian Carter could not explain, no matter how carefully he examined them. The contractor who had repeatedly postponed repairs to the antique shop suddenly called to apologize and arrived the very next morning with a full crew. The delayed furniture shipment appeared before noon, complete and undamaged. Even the insurance paperwork that had seemed trapped inside endless administrative delays was approved without Adrian making another phone call. Friends and neighbors called it a lucky streak, but Adrian simply smiled and returned to polishing old furniture, believing life occasionally rewarded patience in quiet ways. Hollow Creek, however, continued whispering. The mysterious businessman was no longer just a rumor. People had seen him entering Carter Antiques almost every week, leaving with another carefully wrapped treasure and lingering longer each visit. Some believed he planned to buy the shop. Others insisted he was secretly restoring historic buildings throughout town. Adrian ignored every story because none of them matched the thoughtful man who spent afternoons discussing forgotten artists and family heirlooms. To Adrian, Vincent remained the easiest person he had spoken with in years. One crisp Saturday afternoon, Vincent arrived carrying a weathered leather-bound novel. "I found this during an estate auction," he explained. The seller believed it had no value because several pages are stained. Adrian accepted the book with careful hands and slowly turned the fragile pages. A faint smile appeared on his face. The stains came from rain, not neglect. Someone protected this book during a storm. Vincent watched Adrian study the faded cover with quiet admiration. Most people would only notice the damage. Adrian gently closed the novel. Damage tells part of the story. Survival tells the rest. Vincent lowered his eyes for a brief moment, as though those simple words had reached a place inside him that few people knew existed. Before either of them could continue, the front door opened and Mrs. Henderson hurried inside, carrying a basket of homemade cookies. She smiled warmly at Adrian before noticing Vincent standing nearby. "Oh," she said with pleasant surprise. "You must be the gentleman everyone keeps talking about." Adrian laughed awkwardly. "Mrs. Henderson, this is Vincent. He enjoys collecting antiques." The elderly woman studied Vincent for a moment before smiling kindly. "Then you already know Adrian has a habit of giving away more than he keeps." Vincent answered without hesitation. "Yes, that seems to be one of his greatest strengths." Mrs. Henderson nodded thoughtfully. "He has been that way since he was a boy. If someone was lonely, Adrian sat beside them. If someone was hungry, Adrian shared his lunch. My late husband used to say kindness followed that young man the way sunshine follows spring." Vincent remained silent, but every word settled deeply into memories he had guarded for 20 years. After Mrs. Henderson left, an unusual quiet filled the shop. Adrian placed the old novel carefully inside a display cabinet before looking toward Vincent with gentle curiosity. "Can I ask you something?" Vincent met his gaze. "Of course." Adrian hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "You could spend your time anywhere in the country. You have seen more places than I probably ever will. Why do you keep coming back?" "Here." For the first time since arriving in Hollow Creek, Vincent did not answer immediately. He looked around the little antique shop, at the shelves filled with forgotten histories, at the afternoon sunlight filtering through the old front windows, and finally back to the Omega who still had no idea how profoundly he had changed another life. A faint smile touched Vincent's face as he quietly replied, "Because sometimes the place you spend years searching for turns out to be the place that has been waiting for you all along." Autumn settled gently over Hollow Creek, covering the sidewalks with shades of gold and amber that seemed to slow the pace of every afternoon. Carter Antiques welcomed a steady stream of visitors preparing for the town's annual Heritage Gala, a celebration attended by local leaders, business owners, charitable organizations, and several influential guests from across the state. Adrian Carter had never enjoyed formal events. He preferred the quiet comfort of old books, polished furniture, and conversations shared over coffee inside his little shop. When the invitation arrived in the mail, embossed with elegant lettering and addressed personally to him, he assumed it had been sent by mistake. He quietly placed it beneath the cash register, intending to forget about it. 2 days later, Vincent entered the shop carrying another carefully wrapped antique. After discussing a collection of vintage music boxes, Adrian casually mentioned the invitation with an embarrassed smile. "I doubt I belong at something like that," he admitted. "People attend those events to meet important guests, not antique shop owners." Vincent looked at him with calm certainty. Sometimes the most important person in the room is the one who never believes he belongs there. Adrian laughed softly. "That sounds like something from one of your favorite novels." Vincent smiled. The best stories usually contain a little truth. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Henderson stopped by once again to purchase an antique picture frame for her granddaughter. Before leaving, she noticed the unopened invitation resting on the counter. "You are going, are you not?" she asked. Adrian hesitated. "I am still thinking about it." The elderly woman gently shook her head. "Your grandparents spent years helping organize that gala. They believed preserving history meant honoring ordinary people who quietly built a community. You belong there more than most." Her words lingered in Adrian's thoughts long after she had gone. That evening he finally accepted the invitation. News of his attendance spread quickly through the small town. Curious whispers followed almost immediately because many people wondered whether Vincent DeLuca would appear as well. No one knew the answer. Saturday evening arrived beneath a clear sky, filled with early stars. Heritage Hall glowed with warm lights as guests gathered beneath crystal chandeliers and polished oak beams that had overlooked generations of celebrations. Adrian entered wearing a simple navy suit that had served him faithfully for years. He greeted familiar neighbors, accepted polite compliments, and quietly admired historical photographs displayed throughout the ballroom. Although people smiled more warmly than they once had, he still felt slightly out of place among distinguished guests dressed in tailored evening wear. Then the grand entrance doors opened once more. Conversations gradually softened as Vincent stepped inside, wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. Several executives immediately crossed the room to greet him. Community leaders shook his hand with unmistakable respect. Charity directors thanked him for projects that had quietly transformed neighborhoods across the state. Adrian watched the scene with genuine surprise. Until that moment, he had never fully understood the extraordinary influence Vincent carried so effortlessly. Vincent acknowledged every greeting with quiet courtesy before his eyes found Adrian standing near the historical exhibit. Without hesitation, he walked directly across the ballroom, passing business leaders and elected officials alike until he stopped beside the antique shop owner. The room became noticeably quieter. Vincent smiled with calm warmth and spoke clearly enough for those nearby to hear. "I hoped you would come." Adrian returned the smile, still trying to process everything he had witnessed. "I did not realize you knew so many important people." Vincent's answer was simple. "Tonight, there is only one conversation that matters to me." Around them, curious guests exchanged silent glances while watching the two men continue talking as naturally as they always had inside the little antique shop, unaware that before the evening ended, a truth hidden for 20 years would finally step into the light. The ballroom remained alive with quiet conversations, yet Adrian Carter could no longer hear them clearly. His attention stayed fixed on Vincent DeLuca, who stood beside him with the same calm confidence he had carried into the antique shop every week. The difference was that tonight Adrian finally understood why everyone else regarded Vincent with such respect. Before Adrian could ask another question, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and welcomed the guests to the evening's final presentation, inviting several community partners to share brief remarks about preserving Hollow Creek's history for future generations. Vincent's name was announced last. Polite applause quickly grew into genuine admiration as he walked toward the podium. Adrian watched in quiet disbelief while civic leaders, business executives, and philanthropists greeted Vincent as though his presence alone carried extraordinary significance. Vincent thanked the audience for their generosity before allowing a thoughtful silence to settle across the room. People often believe the most important moments in life happen under bright lights, he began in his steady voice. My own life was changed during an ordinary afternoon that almost no one remembers. Curious whispers faded into complete stillness. Vincent continued, 20 years ago, I was a frightened teenager with nowhere to go. I believed the world had already decided what my future would be. Then a young volunteer sat beside me outside a community shelter. He shared his lunch without asking my name. He gave me a worn paperback novel because he noticed I kept looking at it. Before leaving, he smiled and told me that difficult chapters were never the end of the story. Adrian felt his heartbeat quicken. Images long buried beneath years of ordinary life slowly returned to him. A rainy afternoon. A quiet boy sitting alone. A sandwich wrapped in paper. An old paperback rescued from a donation box. Vincent looked directly toward Adrian before speaking again. The young man who offered that kindness never asked for recognition. He probably believed he had done nothing remarkable. But I carried those few minutes with me every single day that followed. The room remained completely silent. Vincent stepped away from the podium and walked through the crowd until he stood beside Adrian once again. His expression was warm, open, and entirely sincere. "Adrian Carter," he said gently, "you once gave hope to someone who had almost forgotten it existed. Everything I have built since then began with that afternoon." Adrian's eyes filled with emotion as the forgotten memory became unmistakably clear. "You were that boy," he whispered. Vincent nodded. "Yes." Adrian searched Vincent's face in astonishment. "I never knew what became of you." Vincent smiled softly. "You were never supposed to carry that responsibility. Your kindness was freely given. That is why it changed my life." Several guests quietly wiped away tears while others lowered their eyes, remembering the careless jokes they had once repeated about the gentle Omega who had quietly devoted his life to preserving forgotten things. Vincent turned calmly toward the audience once more. "Many people have wondered why I kept returning to Carter Antiques. Tonight there is no reason to keep that answer hidden. I did not come because Adrian needed saving. I came because I wanted to thank the person who saved me long before either of us imagined this moment could exist." When the applause finally began, it was not loud or dramatic. It was heartfelt, lasting, and filled with genuine respect. Adrian stood quietly beside Vincent, overwhelmed not by the attention surrounding him, but by the realization that one ordinary act of compassion, offered without expectation 2 decades earlier, had traveled farther than he had ever dreamed possible. When the applause finally faded, nothing about Adrian Carter felt the same, although he himself had not changed at all. The gentle Omega who had quietly opened the antique shop every morning, smiled through years of thoughtless jokes, and believed his life was too ordinary to leave a lasting mark, was still standing in the same navy suit. What had changed was the way the world finally chose to see him. As guests slowly gathered around, they no longer approached with curiosity or whispered speculation. They came with sincere gratitude, offering kind words, heartfelt apologies, and stories about how Carter Antiques had quietly become a place of comfort during difficult seasons of their own lives. Adrian accepted every conversation with the same humility that had always guided him. He did not remind anyone of the laughter he had endured. He did not seek recognition for the kindness that had changed Vincent DeLuca's life. He simply listened, smiled, and thanked each person for coming. Later that evening, after the last guests had left Heritage Hall, Adrian and Vincent stepped outside beneath a sky filled with bright autumn stars. The crisp evening air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and for the first time since they had met, silence between them felt complete rather than uncertain. Adrian looked toward Vincent with quiet emotion. "I spent 20 years believing I had forgotten that afternoon," he admitted softly. "Now I realize I never forgot. I simply never imagined it had mattered so much to someone else." Vincent smiled with gentle warmth. The greatest gifts are often given by people who never stop to measure their value. They began walking slowly through the peaceful streets of Hollow Creek, passing familiar storefronts that seemed somehow different now that old misunderstandings had finally disappeared. Over the months that followed, life continued changing in quiet but meaningful ways. Carter Antiques remained exactly where it had always stood, yet its purpose gradually expanded. With Vincent's encouragement and Adrian's endless love for preserving history, unused rooms behind the shop were transformed into reading spaces, community workshops, and exhibitions celebrating local families whose stories might otherwise have been forgotten. School children visited after class to learn about the town's past. Retirees volunteered to restore heirlooms. Young couples donated family photographs so future generations would remember where they came from. The little antique shop slowly became the heart of Hollow Creek once again. Vincent never tried to change Adrian into someone else. He admired the man who had already existed long before success, wealth, or recognition entered the picture. Their relationship grew naturally through trust, shared purpose, and countless ordinary mornings spent drinking coffee before opening the shop together. There was no need for grand promises because every quiet day they chose each other became a promise all its own. Several years later, visitors entering Carter Antiques would notice an old paperback novel displayed inside a simple glass case near the front entrance. The cover remained worn, its pages permanently marked by rain from many years before. Beneath it rested a small handwritten card that read, "Every life you touch carries a story you may never hear. Be kind anyway." Children often asked why such an ordinary book occupied the most honored place in the shop. Adrian always smiled before answering. "Because someone once reminded me that hope can fit inside the smallest gift." Vincent would quietly watch those conversations from nearby, grateful that the lesson which had saved one frightened teenager now continued reaching countless others. As evening settled once more over Hollow Creek, Adrian locked the front door beside the man who had spent years searching for the person who unknowingly changed his future. Together they walked home beneath streets glowing with warm golden light, proving that true worth is never measured by popularity, age, or the opinions of strangers. It is revealed through kindness freely given, remembered by grateful hearts, and carried forward long after the moment itself has passed.